Hi, everyone. Welcome to another week of distance learning and another new video. So this week we're starting a new unit actually, and it's animals. Um, and so, yeah, we'll just jump right into it. This video is an overview of kind of like some important differences between different animals and just some like important vocab words related to them. And then we'll kind of talk more about like individual groups of animals and like the specifics about them next week. But this is kind of an animal overview. So in your OneNote, I have this page and I'll be sending this to you guys so you will also have access to it for your own notes. But basically, we talked previously about what it means to be a plant and what it means to be a fungus and what it means to be a protist. And so now we're here talking about animals. So all animals have some characteristics in common that they have to meet these characteristics in order to be considered animals. And so those characteristics are they have to be eukaryotic, multicellular, and heterotrophic. And usually animals reproduce sexually, but not all of them do. Usually that is the case, but not always. And so basically, like to be an animal, you just have to meet these characteristics. You have to be multicellular, you have to be eukaryotic, and you have to be heterotrophic. Again, heterotrophic means that it's not able to make its own food, so it has to eat other organisms. Animals belong to the domain Eukarya. Because they're eukaryotic, that means their cells have a nucleus. And the kingdom Animalia. Makes sense. And then typically we divide animals into two groups, and this is like probably the one that popped into your head first. There's lots of ways to classify animals, but this is the most common way. And so that's going to be by vertebrates. Well, actually, I'll do invertebrates first. Invertebrates and vertebrates. And that's describing whether or not they have a spinal cord and a spine. So this is no spinal cord, and this is spinal cord and backbone or spine. But they're all animals, so even the most basic count as animals. And then I'll just talk briefly about this, that you can place the different phyla, which is this word here. Phyla is the plural of phylum, so it's the next lowest classification under kingdom, into either vertebrate or invertebrate. And so I've done that here just so you can kind of see the diversity and where there's a lot more diversity. So I'll just kind of talk through these really quickly. Porifera is sponges. And they're the most primitive animals, the first ones to evolve, the most simple, basic things that actually count as animals. Yeah, and then Cnidaria, the C is silent. Cnidaria is jellyfish, hydra, which we'll talk more about when we get to asexual reproduction, and corals. So a lot of people don't know that, but corals are actually animals. They're not plants. They're not rocks. They're alive, and they are cnidarians. Echinodermata is starfish and sand dollars, which again, sand dollars actually are animals, which you might know or you might have never thought about before. But if you've ever found a sand dollar on the beach, definitely doesn't look like an animal, but it really is. If you ever found an alive one on the beach, you can see that it has like little hairs on the bottom that are moving, but they are echinoderms with starfish. And then nematoda is roundworms. Platyhelminthes is flatworms. So like a tapeworm is in Platyhelminthes. Mollusca are mollusks, so this includes things like clams. It also includes like barnacles. And then really interesting, it actually includes octopi, cephalopods, squid, and it even includes snails and slugs. So pretty diverse. You might not know that snails and slugs are mollusks, but they actually are. Most mollusks are aquatic, but snails and slugs are terrestrial mollusks. And then arthropods are insects, spiders, scorpions, and actually crabs, crustaceans, and lobsters. And then I'll just say here that arthropods is the most diverse. Oops. Animal phylum, which a lot of people think about like mammals as being the most diverse because those are the ones that we see most often, but there are actually way more, millions more species of arthropods and even just insects than there are of mammals. And then there's actually one phyla that I forgot to put on here that's important, and that's annelids. I'm writing it in Latin, but in English it's annelids. And these are earthworms or segmented worms. So the roundworms, the nematodes, are not segmented. They're more simple than annelids are. Yeah. And then in vertebrates, there's only one phylum of animals, which is chordates, and that includes, well, I'll just say first that it's because it has a spinal cord. So anything that has a spinal cord goes into chordates, and it's divided into these different classes, which are the animals that you probably think of most commonly. So they are going to be things like fish, and fish actually can be divided into bony fish and cartilage fish. Cartilage fish are things like sharks and stingrays. And then amphibians, and then reptiles, birds, and mammals. So I'm just going to say here that that's a terrible, I'm going to do that again. That the invertebrates are much more diverse. And there are many more invertebrates than vertebrates. Which is something I think is a common misconception about animals, but is true. Okay, so now that we've done kind of a little overview of the different animal phyla and kind of where they fall and what they are, I want to talk to you guys about some ways that they are actually different from one another. So we'll kind of go through this one by one. I put some pictures on here of just some like cool examples. I think they're cool. Examples of these different characteristics of animals and how they differ. And this week, you guys are going to be working on a project where you choose one animal, kind of find all these things out about your specific animal. But I wanted to do an overview for everyone first. So some ways that animals are different is in their symmetry. The symmetry describes like being the same on both sides. And there are three different types of symmetry that occur, or really two types of symmetry that occur in animals, and they are radial symmetry, which is this one. So this is symmetrical, kind of like a wheel is symmetrical. I'll say wheel-like symmetry. A lot of times these animals are round, but they don't have to be round. So this example here is a brittle star. It's actually a real animal. It's a starfish. It goes in echinoderms. But it is symmetrical radially, which means like any way you slice it, going around. So I'll just slice it this way. That's not right. Any way you slice the starfish, as long as you go straight down the middle, it will be symmetrical to the other side. This is a 5-pointed starfish. So you can see, like, I can slice it anyway. My lines are not perfect, but you can slice it kind of like you would be able to slice a pizza. So things like that are starfish, sand dollars, jellyfish, those sorts of animals. Okay, then the second option is bilateral, which this is more common. The example I have here is a hammerhead shark. Bilateral symmetry means that it's the same. So same from head to tail. Obviously, not everything has a tail, but it would be like slicing straight down the middle. So you would have a left side and a right side. Now, obviously, we're not symmetrical and animals are not symmetrical if you slice them front to back. But if you slice side to side, that's bilateral symmetry. So things that have like two eyes are going to be bilaterally symmetrical. And then this shark, you can slice down the middle. Again, not a perfect line, but that's bilateral symmetry. And then some animals, which really is only sponges, have no symmetry. So I'll just say this is only sponges. It's more advanced to be symmetrical. So it's another example of why sponges are considered to be like the most primitive animals because they don't have any symmetry. So there you go. SpongeBob is not obviously a real example of sponge because he is symmetrical. He's bilaterally symmetrical if you like look at SpongeBob. But that's not how sponges really are. So there you go. Okay. So aside from symmetry, animals also differ in the ways that they maintain homeostasis. Hopefully you remember that this word homeostasis means keeping their internal environment stable. Really important if you basically everyone's and every animal's cause of death is just a failure to maintain homeostasis. So really important to maintain it. One way that animals have to do this is with temperature regulation. So we can split animals into two different groups, which are cold-blooded and warm-blooded animals, which I'm sure you've heard of before, but there's a scientific word for that, of course. So I'll do this one first because I think this is warm-blooded, and they're called endothermic. This is warm-blooded, which means that they do not depend on their environment to regulate their temperature. And that's humans are like that. This animal is called a jerboa. It's really cool. It's like a kangaroo mouse almost. Some species have really, really, really giant ears, but videos of them are really cool because they can run and jump really fast. But they're endothermic, which means they do not rely on their environment to maintain a stable temperature. And then there's which means that they're cold-blooded. And what cold-blooded really means is that they depend on to regulate temperature. So most often, I think we think of reptiles. This picture is an African bush python. It's a really beautiful snake. But ecto means out, like outside. And so they're depending on their outside environment to make sure that their temperature stays stable. And that's why you see reptiles like turtles sunning themselves on logs and why snakes start to come out in the spring because they have to be in the sun to keep themselves from freezing. Endo means inside. And so endothermic animals like us are using our inside bodies to insulate and make sure that our temperature stays about the same. So even when you are feeling cold, your internal temperature is still stable, unless you have hypothermia. But for the most part, your body is really good at keeping your temperature really stable. Okay, so that's temperature regulation, but also important in homeostasis is respiration. And of course, when we talked about osmosis, salt concentration and waste release, but we'll just talk about respiration here. So animals have to have oxygen because they need it to do cellular respiration. All animals are going to do cellular respiration. If they can't do cellular respiration, they die. So even an underwater animal like a fish has to have a way to get oxygen to its cells for cellular respiration to make ATP. So there's three different ways shown here of how animals can get that oxygen. The first one is gills. And what helps oxygen out of the water? What's gills? The gills on this betta fish probably are about here. You can't see them super well, but they're just little slits. And then the slits actually have blood vessels that are right up against the openings. And so the oxygen diffuses out of the water into the blood because in the blood there's a lower concentration of oxygen. So that's a real life example of diffusion. Lungs is the other option, one of the other options. So this is a great blue whale. It has the largest lungs of any organism. The air enters the lungs of the blue whale through a blowhole, which is kind of equivalent to like your nose. It's just on the back of its head instead of being on the front of its face. But lungs, again, have kind of like gills, blood vessels right up against them that allow the oxygen to diffuse. So they have high surface area for diffusion of oxygen. That's how they work. And that's how yours work too. We'll talk about that when we get to anatomy. And then the other option is this organism is a salamander and it has external gills. So that's these. It's basically like if you took the gills of a fish and flipped them inside out, that's what they would look like. These are external gills. But mostly this salamander and amphibians in general, frogs, other salamanders like newts, stuff like that, they breathe through their skin. And so the skin has to be moist, and that's why amphibians can't go far away from the water. They'll literally suffocate because they don't have well developed lungs and they also don't have really great gills. So they're like kind of in the middle, definitely in the middle. But their skin acts as a way for oxygen to enter blood from air. So again, it will be diffusion, but their skin has to stay wet. If their skin dries out, they can't breathe, which is pretty crazy to think about. But and like I said before, there are other things in homeostasis that are really important besides temperature and respiration. Waste removal is one example. And salt concentration is one example. And for us, our kidneys are really important in both of those and making sure that we have the right levels of salts in our blood and also that we get rid of toxic waste that our cells produce, which in our case is urea, which is why it's called urine when you pee. Fish secrete ammonium, which is really toxic, ammonia, into the water, straight into the water, which then it like dilutes and it's fine. But yeah, so there you go. Waste removal is also important. Okay. Another way that animals are different from one another is the role that they have in their ecosystem and what and how they eat. So, like I said before, all animals are heterotrophs, which means they have to eat other things, but the way that they go about doing that is really different. So, like a sponge or a lot of ocean animals, corals are going to be filter feeders, especially if they're non-modal, like a sponge or a coral. Like their food is just going to be whatever drifts by them. Jellyfish are kind of like that too. Um, Obviously, for some animals, they're like apex predators. They're really good hunters, but it varies by ecosystem and by animal. So the different roles in the ecosystems that they could have are primary consumers, and those are going to be herbivores, which means they eat plants. Secondary consumers, which are going to be omnivores. and they eat both plants and other animals. And then sometimes they're called tertiary consumers. You can have upper level consumers. You can just keep going like 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up. And then you have apex predators. And they're called apex predators because they're at the top of the food chain, but they're going to be carnivores, which means that they only eat other animals. So it's going to be things like lions, wolves, sharks, orcas, polar bears. They're typically really large animals, and also typically an ecosystem will only have one apex predator because there's just not enough nutrients in the ecosystem to support having lots and lots of apex predators. They have to eat so much in order to like have enough energy to even stay alive. You might know this, but every time you eat, you only get 10% of the energy that was in your foods, which is why carbohydrates are such high energy foods because they're directly produced by plants, the producers. But if you're an apex predator, it means maybe you're eating something that ate something that ate something that ate something, which means by that point you're getting very little energy from your food. So you have to eat a lot more, which means the ecosystem just can't support like huge numbers of apex predators ever. And then the last thing that an animal could be is decomposer. And we talked about them when we talked about fungi, but they eat dead or decaying materials. So something that I probably think of is like a vulture or like a condor. They can be considered decomposers. And then also like a lot of organisms that live on the ocean floor would be considered decomposers as well, like a crab. Okay, so then also, I think this is the last thing. Yeah, so the last way that they can be different is their reproductive strategies. And this is a little bit complicated, but it's worth talking about. So animals, of course, have to be able to reproduce. And most animals are sexually reproducing organisms. So we'll talk about that first. But animals that reproduce sexually can have either internal or external fertilization and internal or external development. And internal means that it's going to happen inside the body of the mother. External means outside. And when it's external, it's usually going to be, it's always pretty much going to be in water. And then development is the same thing. So I'll just go over here and say internal development is going to be inside the mother. We obviously have internal development. You develop for 9 months inside your mother. And then external development is going to be inside an egg. Or not even, like if you're a coral, corals have external fertilization and external development, which means that they release their sperm and egg into the water. The sperm and egg come together in the water, and then they fuse, they create a new coral. And that's it. So that's external and external. We have internal and internal. So it just kind of depends. It can be any combination of those two things. If I go over here, I want to just talk about kind of the differences and the different egg layers and birth strategies. So the first one is obviously a turtle coming out of an egg. This is called oviparous, which means and the organism will hatch out of the egg. So it's like reptiles, birds, fish, most fish. Yeah. The other option, one of the other options, is that they could be ovoviviparous. So if they're ovoviviparous, that means that they are in eggs, but the eggs are stored inside the mother, and then they hatch actually inside the mother, and then they're released. And some insects do this, and also seahorses. That's why I have their picture here. This is called ovoviviparous, which I think I spelled oviparous wrong. I think that should have been OUS. Maybe. Google it. Sorry. You know, spelling is not one of my strengths. Okay. Ovoviviparous means that eggs hatch inside mother and babies are released. And a lot of spiders do this too, which you maybe have seen before if you like stepped on a spider and didn't know that it had babies inside of it. It's like really scary. And then the last option is viviparous. And that's like us. That means gives live birth. And most mammals are viviparous. They give live birth. Now, I also put this kangaroo on here and this hedgehog because they are examples of kind of weird situations. So the kangaroo is a weird situation because it's a marsupial. And a marsupial is a mammal that gives birth to very immature offspring. And then the offspring continue to live in a pouch on the mother. That's like a kangaroo. Most marsupials actually live in Australia. Koalas. There are a few others. Wombats, I think. Yeah. And then this guy, he's called an echidna. He's a monotreme, which are a weird group of mammals. There's only three. The other one's platypus, and I can't remember what the other one is. But they are mammals that lay eggs. So they're kind of a weird group too. Most mammals don't do that. Most mammals are viviparous, and another word for that, I'll say placental. This is a mammal that gives live birth. Those are kind of the different reproductive strategies. Being oviparous would mean that you had external development. If you're ovoviviparous or if you're viviparous, that's going to be internal development. They develop inside the mother's body. So there you go with that. All right. Also, there are two types of eggs. So for organisms that are viviparous, there are two options. One of them is more advanced than the other, and that's the first picture. This is called an amniotic egg, which I think we talked about on one of the assignments you guys did with classification. But they're more advanced because they have this outer shell or skin. This is a reptile egg in the picture. And they also have a food source for the baby to eat while it develops, and that's the yolk. So when you guys eat eggs, they are amniotic eggs, but they're unfertilized. So no like baby chicken is developing in there. But if it was, it would be using the yolk as its food source. And then the other option is to not have any sort of protective shell. I don't know what the name of this egg is called. I don't even know if it has a name. But these, I'll just say, more primitive, water-based eggs. And these are going to be for fish and amphibians. This picture is of frog eggs. Amniotic eggs are going to be only for reptiles, birds, and some mammals, which would only be the monotremes from above. And then there are other types of eggs too, like insects lay eggs. There are other types that I'm not going to tell you about, but just know that there are more. All right, and then the last possibility is that you could actually have animals that are asexual, and they do exist. So this first one here is a flatworm. This is crazy. Can regenerate. So what has happened here is literally the head of this flatworm was cut off. That's what decapitation means. And then after 2 weeks, it's grown back into being a flatworm just as big as it was before. That's that's like pretty crazy. Obviously, most animals can't do that, but some can. That's a form of asexual reproduction. Hydra, which I talked about when I talked about jellyfish before, they're really primitive animals, but they can actually do budding, which we talked about with bees. And that's shown in this picture where basically like the offspring will start to grow off the side of a mature organism and it will eventually break off and go somewhere else. Kind of this like polypy sea anemone like thing that's happening there. That's asexual budding. And then this is really crazy. This is called parthenogenesis. And basically, what happens with parthenogenesis is the female egg can fertilize itself, which is crazy time. So there's no fertilization. Bees actually do this. And what happens, so here's the parthenogenesis down here, the arrow, is if the queen reproduces by parthenogenesis, basically like fertilizes her own eggs, then what's produced are the drones of the hive, which are male bees, which is really wild. And I don't exactly know like how the queen like fertilizing her own egg can lead to males, but it does. And then also, if the egg is fertilized, then there's two options of what can be produced, which is either a worker bee or another queen bee. And in bees, it depends what they're fed if they become a queen bee or if they become a worker bee. So the queens are actually fed this special like high protein food called royal jelly, and the regular workers get fed honey. But it's really crazy how like advanced their society is, I guess, on bees. Ants, there's some species of ants that work the same way where what they're fed determines like how they end up being later in life. One example is the big-headed ants, which you guys might remember from the ant like things that we did earlier on. But if they're fed a high protein diet, they end up with the like giant heads. And if they're fed a high sugar diet, they end up with the small heads, which is crazy. Like it's really interesting that your diet can have such a big impact. But that's parthenogenesis. There's some evidence that it also happens in like some snakes, wasps, and then other like more primitive animal organisms. So that's that. All right, very last thing about reproduction in animals is reproductive strategy. So there's two possible reproductive strategies, and there's a whole lot of animals that fall in between. And they're called either being an R strategist or being a K strategist. So if you're an R strategist animal, what happens is you produce many offspring with very little parental involvement after birth. So the biggest R strategist on this chart is an oyster, and they produce 500 million oyster offspring a year. Now, most of them won't survive, and that's the reason why they're producing so many, because the strategy is produce as many as you can. Know that a lot of them aren't going to survive because they're not being cared for, they're not being protected. And that's the way it goes. So sea turtles are kind of like this, not as much as oysters, but they are, where the mother lays her eggs, she goes back to the ocean. When the turtles hatch, like they have to make it through the water. A lot of them don't survive, but that's why she laid a lot of eggs. So that's an R strategist. A K strategist is more like what humans are, and this is producing very few offspring with high parental involvement after birth. So in these types of animals, like think about an elephant. The elephant might have one offspring, and it's going to care for that offspring until the offspring is all the way grown up and able to defend and care for itself. So the strategy here is to not have very many offspring, but put a ton of energy into making sure that your offspring survives to reproduce so that your species can continue. That's the difference. Okay, so basically, in summary, animals are super, super, super diverse. They're amazing. There's so many different ones. This week, you guys are gonna have an opportunity to choose an animal that you want to focus on and learn kind of all this stuff about it. But yeah, just know that there's so many out there. They're so diverse. They're so cool. So take time to like really choose a cool one and really learn something about it. That's it for this week. Hope you guys are doing great. Miss you lots as always. And I'll see you on Zoom. Bye.